Hey guys, tonight we're talking about what it was really like to be Cleopatra's royal lover. The perfume strong enough to mask a small plague, the political schemes sharp enough to slice your reputation to ribbons, and the intoxicating combination of power and paranoia that came from sharing a bed with the last pharaoh of Egypt. If you're enjoying our sleepy history journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy community grow across the world. Now close your eyes and lay back. Being Cleopatra's royal lover was not a simple matter of romance. It was a political act with the weight of empires behind it. Cleopatra VII Philopater, last ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, was as much a strategist as she was a seductress. She could speak at least 7 languages, recite Homer from memory, and negotiate with foreign emissaries while making them feel they had already agreed to her terms before they'd even sat down. To share her bed meant sharing her enemies, her ambitions and her calculated performances of divine royalty. Your days would be divided between the intoxicating opulence of the Alexandrian palace and the ever-present tension of Egyptian politics. Inside the palace walls, gold-inlaid couches rested beneath ceilings painted with images of the gods, their eyes watching as though they were silent members of court. Perfumed oils hung heavy in the air, and silk curtains drifted in the Mediterranean breeze. Yet every moment of luxury came with the unspoken understanding that outside those marble halls, Egypt's independence was eroding under the pressure of Rome's influence. Meals could pass for theatrical productions. Platters of figs and pomegranates from Upper Egypt sat beside imported wines from Crete, honey cakes dusted with cinnamon, and fish so fresh it had been pulled from the Nile an hour before. Musicians played lutes and sistrums while dancers moved in rhythm with the scent of burning myrrh. It was meant to dazzle you into forgetting the tension, but the tension never left. Because in the politics of ancient Egypt, pleasure was never free from consequence. Cleopatra's public appearances were masterclasses in statecraft. She might arrive on her royal barge along the Nile dressed as the goddess Isis, sails of deep purple catching the wind, oars moving in perfect unison. Attendants fanned her with peacock feathers, while braziers burned incense that trailed into the air like divine offerings. You would be at her side, fully aware that every eye on the riverbank was not just watching her, but also measuring you, wondering what influence you held. The question was whether it would last until the next political storm. To be her lover meant stepping into her legend, but it also meant becoming a piece in a game that had already claimed countless lives. One day, you might be reclining under a canopy on the palace terrace, gazing over the sparkling waters of the harbour. The next, your name could be whispered in Rome's Senate, folded into accusations that might strip you of everything. The truth was, in Cleopatra's Egypt, affection and alliance were inseparable. Passion was political currency, and you were always being spent. And yet, there was no denying the magnetism. History remembers Cleopatra as a temptress, but those who lived in her world knew she was far more dangerous than beauty alone. She was the embodiment of Egypt's cultural fusion, Greek education, Egyptian divine authority, and a mastery of spectacle that rivaled Rome's greatest triumphs. To be close to her was to be close to the pulse of an ancient kingdom in its final, defiant years. But luxury in Alexandria was never still. The wine goblets could be filled with suspicion as easily as vintage red. The scent of lotus flowers could mingle with the stench of betrayal. And every time you lay your head down beside her, the weight of history and the gaze of 2 empires was already pressing on your chest. Because in this role, survival was never just about avoiding enemies. It was about understanding that the most dangerous place in the Ptolemaic world wasn't on a battlefield. It was in Cleopatra's inner circle, and you were already in it. The palace itself was a living declaration of power. Its walls were faced with polished limestone that caught the Alexandrian sun until it seemed to glow. Mosaic floors depicted scenes of Nile gods bestowing gifts on the Ptolemaic rulers, each tessera carefully chosen to shimmer in candlelight. The hall smelled faintly of cedarwood chests and imported frankincense, scents that had to be replenished daily because luxury in Egypt was not meant to be subtle. Even the soundscape was deliberate. Water trickled from bronze fountains into shallow pools filled with lotus blossoms. Servants moved in soft-soled sandals to muffle their steps, creating the illusion that everything in the palace ran on the same smooth, quiet rhythm. Your quarters were lavish but strategic. Privacy was an abstract concept here. The position of your rooms was less about your comfort and more about optics. Being housed near the Queen's private chambers was a visual statement for foreign envoys to observe when they visited. It told them you were in her confidence, which was a political truth that could change at any moment. The bedding was linen of the highest quality, cool to the touch and faintly scented with rose water, but it was also maintained by a rotation of attendants who were as much informants as they were caretakers. Meals were another arena where politics wore the disguise of indulgence. The Ptolemaic court understood that food could be used as persuasion. Egypt's grain was the envy of the Mediterranean, and controlling its export meant controlling the mood of nations. Banquets were designed to flaunt abundance. Dishes included honey-glazed duck, roasted quail stuffed with dates, and flatbreads drizzled with sesame oil. Bowls of olives from Cyrene and cheeses aged in clay jars from the Nile Delta would be placed within arm's reach. Wine was poured into cups carved from onyx or blown from translucent Alexandrian glass, a material so prized that Rome imported it in bulk. Every sip and every bite was a reminder that Egypt was still the breadbasket of the ancient world, even as Rome's shadow lengthened across the horizon. But the palace was not a bubble. Alexandria itself was a city unlike any other in the ancient world, a deliberate fusion of Greek design and Egyptian tradition. Founded by Alexander the Great, it was laid out on a grid, its streets wide enough for chariots to pass each other without incident. The city's population was a mix of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and traders from as far away as India. The port was a constant churn of sails and shouted orders, with ships unloading amphorae of olive oil, ingots of copper, and exotic animals bound for the royal menagerie. From your vantage point in the palace, the city looked orderly, but you knew that beyond the marble facades there were crowded markets, brine-scented alleys, and taverns where dock workers grumbled about grain prices while drinking beer made from barley. The most commanding feature of Alexandria was the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood over 300 feet tall, a monumental symbol of Ptolemaic engineering. Its fire burned constantly at night, reflected by polished bronze mirrors to guide ships into the harbour. By day, sunlight off the same mirrors could be seen for miles across the Mediterranean. Being Cleopatra's companion meant you could take a private barge across the harbour to view it, but it also meant hearing the murmurs about how Rome might soon claim this marvel as its own. Religion was woven into every layer of public life, and Cleopatra's identity as the living embodiment of Isis was both a political and spiritual performance. In ceremonies, she would appear in flowing white robes with a crown shaped like a solar disk flanked by cow horns. To the Egyptian populace, this was more than theatre. The pharaoh was a link between the mortal and divine worlds, ensuring the flooding of the Nile and the prosperity of the land. As her consort, you were expected to participate in rituals that to a Greek-trained mind might seem like elaborate pageantry, but were in fact vital affirmations of cosmic order. Offerings were made in temples where incense clouded the air, and priests chanted hymns in hieroglyphic meter. You learned quickly that participating poorly in these rites could stir quiet resentment among the priesthood, a group with more political sway than most foreign observers understood. Your position also required you to navigate the intricate hierarchy of court officials. The Ptolemaic bureaucracy was vast, with scribes recording everything from tax shipments to the breeding of sacred animals. The scribes themselves were not to be underestimated. In an age when literacy was rare, those who could write in both Greek and Egyptian held the keys to communication between rulers and the ruled. They could delay an order, alter a report, or subtly reframe a decree without ever being accused of disobedience. Courting their favour was as important as maintaining Cleopatra's. The reality was that being close to the Queen meant absorbing the constant thrum of diplomacy. Embassies from Rome, Nubia, and various Hellenistic kingdoms passed through Alexandria, each bringing gifts that were catalogued, displayed, and often used as leverage in future negotiations. Ivory tusks from the Upper Nile, jars of frankincense from Arabia, and silver coinage stamped with foreign rulers' profiles found their way into the palace treasury. To the untrained eye, these were mere tributes, but in truth, each item represented a network of trade agreements and political dependencies that could unravel with a single misstep. Even the city's celebrated Library of Alexandria played a role in this network of power. Housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, it was both a repository of knowledge and a symbol of intellectual dominance. Any ship docking in the harbour was required to surrender its manuscripts for copying, ensuring the library's collection remained unmatched. Access to its archives was a privilege, and while you might stroll its colonnades, you would also be aware that the ideas housed there could be as politically dangerous as any army. A well-placed historical precedent or an obscure legal text could be wielded in court debates to devastating effect. All of this existed under a constant, unspoken truth. Egypt's wealth and beauty were irresistible to Rome, and Rome had a habit of consuming what it desired. Every luxury, every ritual, every display of abundance was not just for domestic pride. It was a performance aimed at convincing both allies and enemies that Egypt was too powerful to be absorbed. Your role in this was not simply personal. By standing beside Cleopatra, you were helping to project an image of stability and strength, even when you knew the reality was far more fragile. And so the days passed in a rhythm that felt eternal on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. You walked marble corridors under ceilings painted with constellations, reclined on couches draped in imported textiles, and listened to the distant hum of the city's marketplaces. But beneath every note of music and every scent of incense, there was the steady pulse of a kingdom playing for time. Because in Alexandria, beauty was never separate from strategy, and pleasure was never separate from survival. Travel with Cleopatra was never a simple matter of movement from one place to another. It was a carefully orchestrated extension of the palace itself, designed to remind every observer that Egypt's queen was both mortal ruler and divine presence. The royal barge was the most famous of these travelling stages, a vessel so large and lavish that it could serve as a floating court. Its hull was plated in gold leaf that caught the sunlight until it appeared to blaze across the Nile. The sails were deep purple, the rarest and most expensive dye in the ancient world, extracted drop by drop from Mediterranean sea snails. This colour alone signalled to anyone on the riverbank that the vessel belonged to someone above ordinary mortal rank. Your place on the barge was both an honour and a hazard. The honour was obvious. Few in Egypt ever stood so close to the queen outside of the palace. The hazard was more subtle. Every movement you made, every glance, every expression would be watched by attendants, dignitaries, and foreign envoys. In the world of Nile politics, a raised eyebrow at the wrong moment could be interpreted as agreement with a policy or as silent dissent. The journey was as much about performance as arrival. The Nile itself was the lifeline of Egypt, and to sail upon it was to move through a living calendar. The banks shifted from lush green fields in the fertile floodplain to stretches of arid desert where the wind carried the scent of sand and dry stone. Farmers in linen kilts would stop their work to watch the barge pass, shading their eyes as incense smoke trailed from the prow. Along the way, the boat would dock at temples where offerings were made to ensure the continued favour of the gods. At each stop, priests greeted the queen with hymns, their voices echoing against the carved walls that still held traces of paint from centuries-old ceremonies. Security on such voyages was as elaborate as the ceremonial displays. Smaller vessels flanked the barge, crewed by soldiers armed with spears and shields, their eyes scanning both banks for signs of trouble. While Egypt was nominally stable under Cleopatra's rule, the reality was that river travel always carried risks. Banditry along the Nile was not unheard of, and the Queen's position as both a political and symbolic figure meant any threat to her was a threat to the stability of the kingdom itself. As her companion, you were part of this protective display, a visible reminder to onlookers that her court was not easily approached. The interiors of the barge were no less impressive than the palace. Rooms were draped with linen curtains embroidered in gold thread, and the floors were layered with reed mats woven in geometric patterns. Bowls of fresh fruit, dates, figs, pomegranates, sat beside jugs of wine cooled in clay jars submerged in river water. Musicians played the double pipes, their melodies mixing with the rhythmic splash of the oars. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh, chosen as much for its association with divine rites as for its ability to mask the less romantic smell of a river teeming with life. From a historical perspective, this blending of luxury and mobility was not merely indulgence. Egyptian rulers had long understood that their presence along the Nile reinforced their connection to the land and its people. The river was the source of Egypt's agricultural wealth, and the annual flooding, the inundation, was seen as a divine gift. By travelling along the water, the Queen was not only inspecting her domain, but also performing a sacred role, ensuring the gods would continue to bless the cycle of fertility and harvest. Of course, there was another layer to these journeys, the layer visible to Rome. Foreign envoys often joined segments of the voyage, and their reports would travel faster than the current back to their superiors. A journey down the Nile was therefore as much a diplomatic event as any formal treaty signing. The opulence of the barge, the discipline of the escorting vessels, and the devotion of the priests were all part of the message. Egypt was still powerful, still rich, still a player in the politics of the Mediterranean. Travelling with Cleopatra also meant exposure to the scale of her influence outside Alexandria. Smaller towns along the Nile were quick to stage their own displays for the royal arrival. Markets overflowed with produce, livestock was paraded before the Queen, and local officials presented gifts meant to catch her favour. Some of these gestures were purely symbolic, but others were strategic, seeking reduced taxes or favourable trade rights. You would quickly learn to read these encounters for what they were, negotiations disguised as devotion. The journey was not without its discomforts. The Nile, though majestic, carried the constant hum of insects. The sun could be merciless, baking the deck until the heat shimmered in the air, and despite the grandeur, the motion of the barge could be felt in every step. On windy days, the sails strained and the ropes creaked like the rigging of a warship. The splendour did not erase the reality that river travel in the ancient world was dictated by nature's rhythms, not human schedules. Yet at night, when the barge anchored and torches were lit along the deck, the effect was mesmerising. The dark water reflected the flames until it seemed the vessel floated in a sea of stars. The music softened to low rhythms, and the Queen would appear on the upper deck, her silhouette framed against the glow. From the shore, villagers would see not a woman, but the embodiment of Egypt's divine and earthly power. From your place beside her, you would feel the weight of that illusion, an illusion you were now part of maintaining. Because every voyage was more than a journey. It was a message written in gold and silk, carried on the current for all to see, and you were as much a part of that message as the Queen herself. The private court of Cleopatra was a world within a world, hidden from public ceremony but no less calculated in its function. Here, in the innermost chambers of the palace, decisions were made that could sway the fate of kingdoms. It was not a space filled with idle chatter and perfumed lounging, though there was plenty of both on the surface. It was a tightly wound network of influence where status could shift as quickly as the tide in Alexandria's harbour. As her companion, you found yourself walking a constant line between privilege and peril. Attendants were the first layer of this inner machinery. They were not merely servants. Many came from noble families who had offered their children into palace service as a form of political insurance. A maid refilling your wine cup might be the niece of a provincial governor. A scribe delivering a message might have relatives controlling crucial grain shipments to the capital. Every interaction was a small diplomatic exchange, whether you realized it or not. Beyond the attendants were the advisors, individuals whose authority came from mastery of knowledge as much as from proximity to the queen. There were economic specialists who tracked grain yields with the precision of military accountants. There were astrologers who calculated planetary alignments to determine the most favourable days for treaties or military campaigns. And there were cultural intermediaries who could navigate the subtleties between Egyptian tradition and Greek administration, an essential skill in a kingdom still ruled by a Macedonian dynasty, but steeped in native customs. Cleopatra's court also included an unusual degree of female influence for the time. High-ranking women in her inner circle held roles in temple administration, estate management, and even foreign diplomacy. In a period when most royal courts across the Mediterranean were dominated by male voices, this was both a reflection of Egyptian traditions and a product of Cleopatra's own political acumen. Egyptian queens historically had enjoyed greater public visibility and formal authority than their Greek or Roman counterparts, and Cleopatra wielded this precedent to her advantage. Life in the private court moved to a rhythm dictated by a mix of ritual and urgency. Morning audiences might be devoted to temple affairs, with priests reporting on the rituals conducted to honour the gods. Midday could bring a flood of petitions from provincial governors requesting tax relief or military assistance. By evening, the focus shifted to receptions for foreign envoys, where politics played out over banquets and staged entertainments. As her companion, you were expected to remain visible during these events, not because your presence was inherently necessary, but because it signalled the Queen's stability and control over her personal alliances. Gossip was the unspoken currency here. While the palace halls echoed with official business, the quieter conversations carried their own power. Rumours could elevate someone to new heights of influence, or reduce them to polite invisibility. As in all ancient courts, information was traded like coin. A discreet whisper about a failed grain shipment might later resurface as leverage in an entirely unrelated negotiation. You learned quickly that listening was more valuable than speaking. The one who spoke less was often the one who survived longest. Religious authority threaded through every layer of this private sphere. High priests and priestesses of major temples were frequent guests, offering blessings or guidance on the interpretation of omens. Egypt's political and spiritual life were inseparable, and the Queen's position as the living embodiment of Isis meant that ceremonial obligations could not be ignored without consequence. Refusing to attend a ritual, even for reasons of political urgency, could be interpreted as cosmic negligence. To be her partner meant being present in these moments, absorbing their symbolism even if you did not personally believe in their divine necessity. Foreign envoys who gained admission to the private court were treated to a carefully staged version of intimacy. While the public saw Cleopatra as a figure framed by gold and incense, the inner court encounters were designed to create a sense of direct connection. The spaces were smaller, the lighting softer, the voices lower. This was not to suggest vulnerability. It was a tactic, creating the impression that the visitor had been granted a rare and personal audience, when in reality every word and gesture was calculated to further the Queen's objectives. Your own presence in these settings was a living endorsement. You represented the Queen's personal alliances, and thus you were a visible part of the political theatre. Rome in particular paid close attention to such signals. Reports from Alexandria travelled back to senators and generals, who would analyse the composition of her court as though reading the arrangement of pieces on a chessboard. They understood that proximity to Cleopatra was never accidental. The art and decor of the private court reinforced these messages. Walls were adorned with scenes from Egyptian mythology, but subtly adapted to include Greek elements, a visual reminder of the dynasty's dual heritage. Decorative objects were drawn from across the Mediterranean world, silverwork from Asia Minor, ivory carvings from Nubia, glassware from Alexandria's own workshops. Even the layout of the rooms encouraged controlled interaction. with small alcoves and colonnaded corridors designed to break large gatherings into intimate clusters where conversations could be both private and overheard. Living within this space required constant adjustment. You learned to recognise when the air grew heavy with unspoken tension, when a smile was masking an insult, when a sudden burst of hospitality was a prelude to a request. The court was never still. Every day brought new petitioners, new rumours, new alignments of power. As her lover, you could be a central figure in one moment and a peripheral one the next, your influence rising and falling in response to currents that were often invisible until they broke the surface. Yet the private court was also the place where Cleopatra's mastery of human dynamics was most evident. She could move seamlessly from consoling a distressed provincial envoy to discussing grain storage techniques with a logistics officer, then pivot to approving a temple restoration plan, all while giving the impression that none of these matters taxed her energy. To stand beside her in these moments was to understand that power here was not just in armies or wealth, but in the relentless orchestration of human relationships. And as you navigated this intricate web, you began to see that survival in Cleopatra's inner world depended not only on loyalty to her, but on an unerring sense of timing, knowing when to speak, when to withdraw, and when to let silence say what words could not. The feasts of Cleopatra's court were less about satisfying hunger, and more about broadcasting power to anyone lucky enough to be invited, and to everyone else who would later hear exaggerated versions of the night's events. In the ancient Mediterranean, political influence often came dressed as hospitality. A well-fed guest was more likely to be a loyal one, and an awestruck visitor was more likely to carry home stories that would magnify the Queen's prestige. You were seated at the heart of these displays, a position that forced you to keep your posture regal, even when the heat from the oil lamps made the air thick, and the weight of the jewellery on your wrists could double as a training regimen for wrestlers. The dining spaces were arranged with precision. Low couches upholstered in embroidered linen allowed guests to recline in the Greek style, a habit imported to Egypt centuries earlier by the Ptolemaic dynasty. The floors were mosaicked with intricate designs that might depict mythological scenes, Nile landscapes, or symbols of fertility and abundance. Lamps filled with perfumed oil glowed against the polished marble, while incense from Arabia curled upward in ribbons of smoke. Every detail was intended to suggest that Egypt was not merely wealthy, but effortlessly wealthy, as if abundance was a natural state rather than the result of meticulous resource management and aggressive taxation. The menus were astonishing in both variety and reach. Egypt's fertile lands could supply wheat, barley, fruits, and vegetables year-round, but the court supplemented these with goods drawn from every corner of the known world. Honey from the Delta sweetened pastries baked with imported cinnamon. Fish from the Mediterranean arrived wrapped in fresh herbs. Meats were roasted and glazed with pomegranate syrup, and birds were stuffed with figs and nuts before being served whole. Wines came from Crete, Rhodes, and the Levant, each poured into cups of silver or cut glass by servants trained to move silently among the reclining guests. Entertainment was woven into the meal like another course. Musicians played the lute, lyre, and double pipes, creating a shifting background of melody that could rise to fill the room during toasts or soften to allow for intimate conversation. Dancers moved with slow precision, their bracelets chiming in time with the rhythm. Storytellers recited tales from Egyptian and Greek mythology, a subtle reminder of the dynasty's dual heritage. Occasionally trained acrobats would perform in the open spaces between the couches, their contortions eliciting gasps from those unaccustomed to such displays. These feasts were also opportunities for subtle political theatre. Seating arrangements were rarely accidental. Those closest to the Queen were often the guests whose favour she most needed to secure, whether they were Egyptian officials, foreign envoys, or wealthy merchants controlling essential trade routes. Lesser officials might be seated farther away, close enough to witness the grandeur but far enough to feel the sting of exclusion. You, as her favoured companion, occupied a position that was both enviable and scrutinised. Every gesture you made, Every morsel you accepted or declined became part of the silent language of court politics. The scale of these events could rival anything Rome attempted, which was exactly the point. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's independence depended not only on military strength, but on the ability to project an image of cultural supremacy. In a world where rumour travelled faster than ships, tales of Egyptian excess served as both warning and temptation. The Romans, for all their military discipline, were fascinated by luxury, and nothing stirred ambition like the thought of seizing a land that could stage such feasts on a regular basis. One of the more famous aspects of her hospitality was her use of rare and costly ingredients in ways that seemed almost wasteful to outside observers. Pearls dissolved in vinegar, for instance, were said to be consumed as a demonstration of wealth so vast it could afford to destroy treasures rather than hoard them. While historians debate the accuracy of such accounts, the underlying message remains clear. Extravagance was a form of intimidation. If Egypt could casually consume what others would guard in vaults, then it must possess resources beyond imagination. These gatherings were not without their risks. Overindulgence was a political hazard as much as a physical one. A guest who drank too much wine might reveal private opinions or alliances best kept hidden. A poorly timed joke could sour a negotiation. Even the entertainment carried its own dangers. A performance that failed to impress could be interpreted as a sign of declining royal fortune, while one that appeared too decadent might draw whispers of irresponsibility. Cleopatra navigated these tensions with practiced skill, shifting her attention among the guests, adjusting the tone of the evening as easily as she might change the music. For you, these feasts were exercises in stamina and observation. The richness of the food could be overwhelming, and the expectation to remain alert while reclining in comfort was a discipline in itself. The air was heavy with the mixed scents of roasted meats, sweet pastries and floral oils. The constant hum of conversation created a layered soundtrack in which Egyptian, Greek and Latin could be heard blending in the same space. Occasionally the sharp clink of a dropped cup or the burst of laughter from a distant couch would ripple through the atmosphere, momentarily shifting every gaze before the evening's rhythm resumed. These banquets were never entirely about the moment. They were investments in perception, carefully recorded in the memories of guests who would recount them to others long after they left Alexandria. In this way, Cleopatra extended the reach of her court far beyond the palace walls. Each feast was a performance, each performance a message, and every message was designed to reinforce Egypt's image as a kingdom of unassailable wealth, cultural sophistication, and divine favour. As the night wore on and the lamps burned low, the last of the dishes would be cleared, and the guests would depart through colonnades lit by flickering torches. You would remain, still visible beside her, part of the final tableau that would linger in the minds of those who had been present. The evening would dissolve into memory, but its echoes would travel far, carrying with them the image of a queen whose court could make even the most jaded diplomat feel both privileged and slightly overwhelmed. Because in Cleopatra's world, the feast was never just a meal. It was a weapon, a promise, and a reminder that in Egypt, even the act of eating could be a declaration of power. The temples of Egypt were more than places of worship. They were the architectural embodiment of the kingdom's power, and every ceremony within them was a public performance of political legitimacy. To walk beside Cleopatra into one of these sacred spaces was to step into a living myth, one where the line between ruler and deity was deliberately blurred. The air itself seemed to change as you crossed the threshold. Outside, the sun blazed across stone courtyards and market squares. Inside, the dim coolness wrapped around you, scented with incense thick enough to taste on your tongue. The walls rose high above you, carved with scenes of gods granting their blessings to the pharaohs of ages past. Their surfaces still held traces of the brilliant pigments that once made them glow in blues, reds, and golds. Columns soared upward like stone papyrus stalks, their capitals flaring into blossoms. Light entered in narrow beams through small openings, falling onto statues of deities as if the gods themselves were basking in the attention of the mortal crowd. Every angle of design was intentional. Egyptian temple architecture was not meant to invite casual entry. It was meant to humble, to remind you that you were in the presence of cosmic order. As Cleopatra's consort, your position during these ceremonies was carefully staged. You stood close enough to be seen, but never so close as to draw attention away from her. This was her theatre, and the script had been perfected over centuries. The queen would appear in robes of fine white linen, her headdress crowned with the solar disk flanked by cow horns, the symbol of Isis. To the Egyptian mind, this was no costume. The pharaoh was the earthly manifestation of divine will, a vital link between humanity and the gods. The rites performed in the temple were as necessary for the stability of the universe as they were for the political stability of the kingdom. Priests moved in precise patterns, chanting hymns in the ancient tongue that most of the Greek-speaking elite could not understand. Their shaved heads gleamed in the filtered light, and their bodies were anointed with sacred oils. They carried offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fragrant resins, presenting them to statues of the gods before retreating in measured steps. Each action followed an order described in texts preserved for generations. To deviate would be to invite divine disfavour, a risk no ruler could afford, especially not one balancing Egypt's independence against the weight of Rome. One of the most significant rituals was the daily awakening of the god statue. The high priest would open the sanctuary, cleanse the image with water from the Nile, anoint it with oils, and dress it in fresh garments. Offerings would then be placed before it, symbolically feeding the deity. To modern sensibilities, the idea of tending to a stone statue might seem quaint, but in the Egyptian worldview, these acts maintained the proper balance of the cosmos. If the gods were neglected, the Nile might not flood, crops might fail, and the kingdom would fall into chaos. By being present, Cleopatra reinforced the idea that she was personally ensuring the favour of the divine. The music of these ceremonies was unlike the entertainment of the palace. Here the rhythm was slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. Sistra, metal rattles associated with Hathor, were shaken in steady patterns, their metallic hum resonating in the stone chambers. Drums sounded at intervals, their deep tones vibrating through the floor. The combination of incense, chant and vibration could induce a trance-like state in the participants, an effect that blurred the line between religious devotion and political loyalty. Your role in this sacred theatre was mostly silent observation, but the symbolism of your presence was far from passive. To be seen beside the queen in a temple was to be seen as part of the divine order she represented. For some in the crowd, that made you a figure of awe. For others, it made you a potential target for resentment, especially among those who felt the Greek-descended Ptolemaic rulers were outsiders in an Egyptian land. The politics of religion in this era were as complex as any Senate debate in Rome. Cleopatra understood that these ceremonies were as much about communication as devotion. When she made offerings to the gods, she was also making a statement to her people that she honoured Egypt's traditions, that she was a true pharaoh in the ancient sense, and that the land's prosperity flowed through her. The priests understood it too. Their loyalty was not bought with coin alone, but with the queen's active participation in rituals that affirmed their authority and the legitimacy of the entire religious hierarchy. Temples also served as centres of economic power. They owned land, collected taxes, and oversaw the production of goods ranging from linen to beer. In many ways, they functioned as banks and warehouses for the state. When Cleopatra appeared at a temple, she was not only reinforcing her spiritual authority, but also ensuring that these economic engines remained aligned with her policies. The offerings brought during ceremonies were symbolic on the surface, but they were tied to real flows of wealth and resources behind the scenes. The culmination of these events often took place in the innermost sanctum of the temple, where only the highest-ranking priests and the ruler could enter. What occurred in these spaces was kept deliberately mysterious, adding to the aura of the ruler's divine connection. You would never be permitted inside, no matter your closeness to Cleopatra. That boundary served a purpose. Even within the intimacy of political partnership, the divine aspect of kingship was kept apart, a reminder that the person you shared a bed with was also, in the eyes of her people, something more than human. When the ceremonies ended, the queen would emerge into the sunlight, her garments faintly scented with incense, her expression composed in the serene mask of a ruler who had just secured the continued balance of the world. The crowds lining the temple forecourt would bow or kneel, and the murmured prayers of the people would follow her back toward the palace. The imagery was unforgettable, and you, walking beside her in that moment, would understand more clearly than ever that in Egypt, religion was not a separate sphere from politics. It was the stage on which politics played out, the script in which every ruler was expected to perform, and the audience's belief in that performance was as valuable as any army. Diplomacy in Cleopatra's court was a game of layered meanings, where every gesture, every choice of words, and every seating arrangement carried weight. To sit beside her during an audience with foreign envoys was to watch a performance that combined political cunning with an almost theatrical sense of timing. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of Egypt as an independent kingdom in a Mediterranean world increasingly dominated by Rome. The audiences took place in reception halls designed to overawe visitors before the first word was spoken. High ceilings painted with scenes of gods and constellations drew the eye upward, a reminder that the Queen's authority was as much divine as it was temporal. Floors of polished stone reflected the light of oil lamps, and bronze incense burners perfumed the air with frankincense from southern Arabia. The throne itself was elevated on a dais, not purely for visibility, but to create a subtle physical reminder of hierarchy. Cleopatra's strategy in these meetings was rooted in an understanding of cultural codes. To Greek-speaking visitors, she might quote Homer or discuss philosophy in fluent Greek, framing herself as an intellectual equal to the rulers of the Hellenistic world. To Egyptian officials, she would speak in their own tongue, invoking the traditions of the pharaohs and referencing religious concepts that tied her directly to the gods. To Roman envoys, she adopted a different tone altogether, respectful but never submissive, showing an awareness of Roman pride while making it clear that Egypt was not a client state to be handled casually. You could see the effect of these shifts in the body language of her guests. A Greek envoy might lean forward, drawn into a discussion about ancient poetry. An Egyptian priest might bow more deeply when she referenced a sacred text from memory. A Roman delegate might purse his lips in grudging acknowledgement when she spoke with precision about the grain shipments that fed the hungry cities of the Republic. Each was being given just enough of what they valued most to keep them engaged without revealing more than she intended. The topics discussed in these audiences were rarely straightforward. Grain was always at the centre of negotiations, for Egypt's fertile Nile Valley was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Control over its exports was a lever of power that could raise or topple foreign alliances. But behind the talk of trade were layers of military and political calculation. A request for grain relief might be granted in exchange for military aid or for favourable terms in a border dispute. An offer of exotic goods could be the opening move in a larger bid for political recognition. Diplomatic gifts were themselves tools of persuasion. Ivory from Nubia, fine linens from Egyptian workshops, carved alabaster vessels, and gold jewellery were all common offerings to foreign envoys. These were not mere tokens of goodwill. They were calculated investments designed to bind the recipient in a web of obligation. To refuse a gift was to risk giving offence. To accept one was to tacitly acknowledge the relationship Cleopatra sought to establish. Rome posed the most complex challenge. Its Senate was as full of rivalries and shifting alliances as any royal court, and Cleopatra understood that Egypt's dealings with Rome had to be conducted with care. Open defiance could invite military intervention. Excessive compliance could erode Egypt's sovereignty. Instead, she walked a careful middle path, providing grain and financial support when it suited Egypt's interests, while cultivating personal ties to influential Romans who could shield her kingdom from hostile policy. You could not ignore the fact that these personal ties often carried a dual purpose: political alliance entwined with personal intimacy. In the ancient world, rulers and their consorts were not merely private companions, they were visible symbols of broader political realities. To be seen at Cleopatra's side was to be read as part of her diplomatic arsenal, and that meant your role in these meetings was not decorative. The presence of a favoured companion during an audience sent a message about stability, influence, and the Queen's control over her personal alliances. Trade discussions often served as cover for military considerations. Control of the Eastern Mediterranean meant controlling key ports, and every shipment of goods could conceal intelligence about naval strength, political unrest, or shifting alliances. Cleopatra's advisors knew this, and they used the rhythms of diplomatic exchange to gather information as much as to give it. Gifts from other states might arrive with embedded messages, whether in the choice of the goods themselves or in the way they were presented. The tension in the room during these audiences was never absent. Even when voices were polite and smiles were exchanged, you could sense the undercurrent of calculation. One poorly chosen phrase could echo across borders. One too generous concession could be taken as a sign of weakness. Cleopatra navigated this with an ease that belied the effort it required. She could pivot mid-conversation, turning a request for tribute into an opportunity to extract a concession of her own, or recasting a criticism into a compliment without the speaker realizing it had happened. The end of these meetings rarely meant the end of the negotiations. Envoys would leave with their impressions carefully shaped, their stories ready to be carried back to their own courts. Some would return with counteroffers, others would attempt to test the limits of the agreements they had just made. But the important thing was that they left having seen Egypt's queen as a force to be respected, one whose kingdom could not be dismissed as a prize waiting to be claimed. From your vantage point beside her, you could see the invisible threads being woven. A nod to one official might secure a grain shipment. A warm farewell to another could plant the seed of future military cooperation. A carefully chosen gift might create an unspoken debt that would be collected years later. In this way, the palace audiences were not just about managing the present. They were about setting the stage for the next move in a game that never truly ended. And as you stood there, watching the smiles, the measured words, and the exchanges of treasure and promise, you came to understand that in Cleopatra's Egypt, diplomacy was not a matter of treaties alone. It was a constant performance, as intricate and calculated as the patterns on the palace mosaics, and every participant, yourself included, was part of the design. Public appearances in Alexandria were not casual strolls or spontaneous gestures of goodwill. They were deliberate spectacles engineered to keep an entire city, and by extension, an entire kingdom, aligned with Cleopatra's rule. You quickly learned that every time she emerged into public view, the setting, the attire, and even the expressions of those around her were as calculated as the most delicate diplomatic negotiation. The process began hours before the first citizen caught sight of her. Streets along the planned route were cleared of anything unsightly. Market stalls were rearranged to create a controlled frame for the procession, and the scent of incense and freshly baked bread was encouraged to drift into the air. In a port city where traders from every corner of the Mediterranean came to barter and gossip, word of these events travelled quickly. By the time the Queen appeared, the crowd was already thick with locals, merchants, and foreign visitors, eager to witness a display that was equal parts religious devotion, political assertion, and theatrical wonder. The Queen's attire alone was a statement of statecraft. She often appeared in garments that combined Egyptian and Greek elements, visually reinforcing her position as both a native pharaoh and a member of the Macedonian dynasty. Gold and lapis lazuli gleamed in the sunlight, while fine linen clung lightly in the warm Mediterranean air. Her crown or headdress would vary according to the occasion. The vulture headdress for moments of divine association, the solar disk of Isis for religious processions, or a diadem studded with precious stones for purely political appearances. The mode of transport was just as carefully chosen. Sometimes she rode in a gilded chariot drawn by white horses, the wheels sending up small bursts of dust that glinted in the light. Other times, particularly for events tied to the Nile, she would arrive on a smaller but equally ornate barge, its prow carved into the shape of a lotus blossom or the head of a sacred ibis. The vehicle was never the true focus, though. It was the living image of Egypt's power seated within it. Accompanying her were layers of symbolic figures. Priests from major temples walked alongside, chanting hymns in ancient Egyptian. Soldiers in polished armour marched in disciplined rows, their presence a reminder that devotion to the queen was reinforced by the readiness of her army. Musicians played flutes and percussion instruments, the rhythms rising and falling in time with the procession's pace. In the eyes of the crowd, this was not just a parade. It was a moving manifestation of Ma'at, the cosmic order that ensured prosperity, justice, and the proper balance between the gods and humankind. Crowd reactions were part of the theatre. Cries of praise were encouraged at certain moments, strategically timed to ripple through the streets. The people shouted blessings in both Egyptian and Greek, a subtle acknowledgement of the kingdom's dual heritage. Children tossed flower petals, and vendors held up baskets of fruit as symbolic offerings. Foreign visitors, particularly Romans, were given prominent viewing positions so they could carry home vivid accounts of Egypt's unity and abundance. From your place beside her, you could see how these displays worked on multiple levels. To the common people, they reinforced the idea that the queen was both accessible and divine. To the elite, they demonstrated her ability to command loyalty across the kingdom's diverse population. To foreign eyes, they suggested a stability and prosperity that could not be easily challenged without significant cost. The city itself provided a perfect backdrop. Alexandria was not a jumble of narrow, winding streets like many ancient cities. It had been planned on a grid, with wide avenues lined by colonnades and interspersed with open squares that could hold large gatherings. The architecture blended Greek rationality with Egyptian symbolism, creating a visual narrative that mirrored the queen's own image. Processions could move through these spaces like currents in a controlled river, turning the city into a stage set for political theatre. Public appearances were also used to mark significant events. The dedication of a temple restoration, the celebration of a military victory, or the start of the Nile's flood season could all be occasions for a grand procession. These events were not only celebratory, they served as reminders that the Queen's authority was tied directly to the prosperity of the land and the favour of the gods. If the harvest was good, it was because she upheld Ma'at. If the Nile's flood was generous, it was because she had secured the gods' blessing through her leadership. Even the smallest details were political. The choice of jewellery might echo the symbols of a particular temple she wished to honour. The flowers thrown by children might be sourced from a province whose loyalty she was cultivating. The order of participants in the procession could signal which factions held the Queen's current favour. You quickly realise that the crowd was not the only audience. Every foreign envoy, every merchant prince, every priest in attendance was reading these details for signs of shifting alliances. When the event concluded, the Queen would often pause to accept offerings from the people. Baskets of figs, bolts of linen, small statues of protective gods. These gestures were as much about being seen receiving loyalty as they were about the gifts themselves. The crowd would disperse slowly, their conversations carrying the images of the day back into the city's markets, taverns and homes. In this way, the spectacle extended beyond its physical moment, continuing to shape public perception long after the last drumbeat faded. Walking beside her in such moments was to feel the weight of both visibility and invisibility. You were there, yet you were part of the frame, not the painting. The city saw you, measured you, and factored you into their understanding of the Queen's power. But you remained a supporting figure in a performance carefully designed to centre her alone. In these processions, you understood more clearly than anywhere else that Cleopatra's rule was not simply maintained in council chambers or on the battlefield. It was performed, reinforced, and renewed in the eyes of her people through pageantry so seamless that it disguised its own precision. And you, whether you wished it or not, were now a permanent part of that living theatre. The wealth of Cleopatra's Egypt did not rest solely on gold, jewels, or the treasures displayed in the palace. Its real strength flowed in long, slow currents down the Nile in the form of grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and controlling its harvest meant holding a lever of power over cities and states far beyond its borders. To stand beside Cleopatra as she managed this lifeline was to witness a form of rule that was less spectacular than a royal procession but far more decisive in the balance of power. The Nile's annual flood dictated the rhythm of Egypt's economy. Each year, waters swelled from the rains in distant highlands, spilling over the riverbanks and depositing a layer of fertile silt across the floodplain. This natural cycle had been the foundation of Egyptian agriculture for millennia. Fields along the river could produce multiple crops in a year, and the yields were remarkable by ancient standards. But abundance alone did not create power. The Ptolemaic system turned this agricultural wealth into a tightly controlled network of taxation and trade. From your vantage point within the court, you could see how much of the kingdom's administration revolved around the movement of grain. Provincial officials recorded harvests with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Scribes tracked every shipment from the threshing floor to the granaries, noting weights, moisture levels, and even the quality of the baskets used for storage. The great state granaries were architectural feats in their own right, designed to keep grain dry and safe from pests. In a good year, they held reserves large enough to feed not just Egypt's population, but also supply major foreign cities for months. Taxation was both a necessity and a point of resentment. Farmers paid a significant portion of their harvest to the state, and while the system was centuries old, it still fueled occasional unrest. To offset this, Cleopatra was careful to tie the collection of grain taxes to visible benefits. Temple restorations, public festivals, and infrastructure projects were often funded from the revenues. The message was clear: the queen took, but she also gave, and the prosperity of the kingdom flowed through her hands. Grain exports were the true source of Egypt's leverage over Rome. By Cleopatra's reign, Rome's population had grown so large that it could not feed itself without imports. Egypt's grain shipments were essential to preventing shortages that could lead to riots in the streets of the capital. The Roman elite understood this dependence, and Cleopatra understood how to use it. Agreements over grain supply were often woven into larger diplomatic arrangements, granting Egypt the ability to influence Roman policy without direct confrontation. Trade routes radiated from Alexandria like the spokes of a wheel. Ships carried grain westward across the Mediterranean, but they also returned with goods Egypt could not produce in abundance. Fine textiles from the east, metals from the north, and luxury items from as far away as India. The port of Alexandria was a hive of activity, with massive stone quays and warehouses standing ready to handle the constant flow of goods. Customs officials recorded every shipment, collecting taxes and monitoring for contraband. These officials, often overlooked by casual observers, were in fact key players in the economic engine of the kingdom. The management of this wealth required a degree of centralization rare in the ancient world. The Ptolemaic dynasty maintained tight control over agricultural production, trade, and currency. Coinage bore the queen's image, reinforcing her authority every time it changed hands. State monopolies on certain goods, papyrus for example, ensured that profits from their sale flowed directly into the royal treasury. Even the cultivation of certain crops was regulated to maximize both domestic supply and export potential. From your place beside Cleopatra, you saw how economic decisions were never purely economic. A shift in the allocation of grain could stabilize a restive province, punish a disloyal ally, or reward a loyal one. Delaying a shipment to Rome could send a political message without a single spear being raised. Approving a surplus sale to a smaller kingdom could cement a trade alliance that might later prove strategically useful. In this sense, the flow of grain was a form of diplomacy as potent as any treaty. The scale of wealth involved was staggering. Even in times of political tension, Alexandria's markets overflowed with goods. Spices scented the air, bronze vessels gleamed in the sun, and exotic animals were displayed to attract buyers. Moneylenders and merchants haggled in a dozen languages, while ship's crews unloaded cargoes from across the known world. All of it depended on the stability of the grain trade, and all of it could be disrupted if the Nile failed to flood as expected. Drought or low flood levels were a constant threat. In such years, the court's role shifted from managing abundance to mitigating scarcity. Decisions about how to distribute the reduced harvest were politically charged, and the Queen's judgment in these matters could strengthen or weaken her rule. You could feel the tension in the palace during such times, the way conversations grew quieter and more guarded as officials weighed the consequences of each choice. Yet when the floods were good and the harvest plentiful, the mood in Alexandria was buoyant. Public works expanded, festivals grew more extravagant, and diplomatic relations with Rome and other powers took on a more confident tone. Standing beside Cleopatra in these moments, you could sense the unspoken reality that all the pageantry, all the diplomacy, and all the rituals rested on a foundation of grain. Without it, Egypt was vulnerable. With it, Egypt could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful empire of its time. And so, while the gold and jewels dazzled the eyes of visiting dignitaries, you knew that the true treasure of Egypt was stored in massive granaries and moved by the steady hands of sailors and merchants. It was the quiet power of bread that allowed the Queen to command armies, restore temples and host feasts that left foreign envoys speechless. It was the grain, more than the crown or the throne, that kept Egypt's place in the world secure. The grandeur of Cleopatra's court was not measured solely in gold, fleets, or feasts. It was also measured in words, scrolls, and ideas. Few rulers in the ancient world wielded knowledge as deliberately as she did. To stand close to her in these moments was to witness a mind that treated scholarship as both an adornment and a weapon. Alexandria, with its legendary library and museum, was the perfect stage for this kind of intellectual power. The Library of Alexandria was more than a repository of papyrus scrolls. It was a statement that Egypt was the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. Thousands upon thousands of texts were housed there, covering subjects from astronomy to medicine to poetry, copied in Greek, Egyptian, and other languages from across the known world. Any ship docking in the harbour was required to surrender its books for copying, an official practice that ensured the library's collection grew with every tide. The originals were often kept, with the copies returned to their owners. It was an act of cultural appropriation disguised as preservation, and it kept Alexandria's scholarly dominance intact. Cleopatra did not treat the library as a symbolic possession. She engaged with its resources directly. Her fluency in multiple languages, Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, and others, allowed her to access texts without reliance on translators. She studied history not as a passive reader but as a strategist, looking for precedents that could be applied to her own reign. In diplomatic meetings, she could cite examples from Persian, Hellenistic, and even early Roman history, disarming opponents who underestimated her intellectual reach. The Museum of Alexandria, closely linked to the library, was not a museum in the modern sense. It was more of a research institute, where scholars in residence studied mathematics, geography, medicine, and philosophy. These men, and occasionally women, were funded by the crown and expected to produce work that enhanced the prestige of the kingdom. Cleopatra was not content to let them work in isolation. She attended lectures, questioned researchers, and used their findings in the crafting of state policy. Discussions of astronomy, for example, could inform the timing of festivals or agricultural planning. Studies in medicine could be adapted for military or public health purposes. From your perspective beside her, you could see how scholarship was folded into politics. A conversation about tidal patterns might later emerge as part of a naval strategy. An obscure historical treatise might be used to justify a territorial claim in a diplomatic negotiation. Knowledge was currency, and Cleopatra spent it as carefully as she spent gold. Patronage of the arts also served her political aims. Poets, playwrights, and historians were welcomed into court, their works often celebrating Egypt's grandeur and the queen's divine role. These were not idle entertainments. In an era before mass communication, such works were vehicles for shaping public perception. A well-crafted poem could travel faster than an official decree, carrying with it images of Egypt's prosperity and the queen's unmatched elegance. Her own education had been rigorous. As a Ptolemaic princess, she was trained in Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric from an early age. Egyptian religious traditions were also part of her instruction, allowing her to speak convincingly to both the Greek-speaking elite and the Egyptian priesthood. Mathematics, geometry, and astronomy were not merely academic pursuits, but practical tools for governance. Her ability to converse on equal terms with scholars and foreign rulers alike gave her a credibility that few monarchs of her time could match. These intellectual pursuits were not confined to formal settings. Evenings in the palace could include informal gatherings where scholars debated over wine, musicians performed compositions inspired by ancient hymns, and storytellers recited epics under the glow of oil lamps. You would sit among them, absorbing conversations that might jump from the nature of the cosmos to the mechanics of siege warfare, from the medicinal properties of herbs to the philosophical implications of fate. It was in these moments that you understood how deeply the Queen valued the life of the mind. Knowledge also had a performative aspect in Cleopatra's hands. In meetings with foreign envoys, she might reference their homeland's history or quote its poets, creating an immediate sense of familiarity and respect. With Egyptian priests, she could recite hymns in flawless hieroglyphic Egyptian, reinforcing her image as a true pharaoh. With Greek philosophers, she could engage in debates on ethics and governance, demonstrating that her intellect was not confined to the concerns of state. Each interaction was tailored to her audience, a skill that made her seem both universally informed and uniquely attentive. The intellectual life of the court was intertwined with the broader politics of the Mediterranean. Scientific discoveries made in Alexandria were shared selectively, often with an eye toward what advantage they might bring. Cartographers might produce maps that doubled as military intelligence. Astronomers might track celestial events that could be used to frame political decisions as divinely favoured. The line between scholarship and statecraft was thin, and Cleopatra walked it with precision. From where you stood, it became clear that the Queen's power was not just in her armies, her ships, or her wealth. It was in her ability to gather, understand, and deploy information in ways that kept her adversaries off balance and her allies invested. The court was as much a centre of strategy as it was of ceremony, and the mind that guided it was always at work, turning knowledge into influence. And as the oil lamps burned low in the great halls of the palace, you began to see that in Cleopatra's Egypt, the scroll could be as mighty as the spear, and the quiet exchange of ideas could shape the fate of kingdoms as surely as the clash of armies. The palace complex of Alexandria was a living organism, its movements governed by both ritual and necessity. From the moment the first light spilled across the harbour, the day began with a sequence of events that had been refined over generations of Ptolemaic rule. To live within these walls was to exist in a carefully orchestrated environment where every action, from the opening of a chamber door to the changing of the night guard, carried layers of purpose. The first sounds each morning were the soft footfalls of servants lighting oil lamps in the darker corridors and opening shutters to let the sea breeze drift through the marble halls. Even the air seemed different in those early hours, carrying a faint mix of salt from the harbour and the sweeter scent of lotus oil from the inner courtyards. Attendants would bring fresh water from cisterns for washing, pouring it into bronze basins that gleamed in the pale light. The Queen's personal chambers were attended first, and as her consort, your own quarters were close enough to feel the hum of activity. before most of the palace had fully woken. By the time the sun was higher, the courtyards were alive with movement. Scribes unfurled scrolls in shaded alcoves to review the day's petitions. Messengers arrived from various parts of the kingdom, carrying tablets inscribed with reports on grain yields, temple activities, or troop movements. The great reception hall, with its polished limestone floor and towering columns, would be swept clean and prepared for the morning audience. Officials in linen and fine wool gathered here, their eyes darting between one another as they waited for the Queen's appearance. The palace kitchens began their work long before anyone sat down to eat. Fires were kindled in large clay ovens, and the smell of baking bread mingled with the aroma of stewing meats and herbs. Breakfast in the palace was not the indulgent affair of the evening feasts. It was practical. Bread still warm from the oven, figs, dates, soft cheese and honey. Wine was served diluted with water, in keeping with the belief that it was too early in the day for stronger drink. For you, this was a moment to observe rather than be observed, though even here a casual conversation could carry political weight. Midday in the palace was dominated by official duties. Cleopatra's schedule was divided between audiences, administrative meetings, and private consultations. Her role as ruler required constant attention to matters ranging from taxation to military readiness, and as her companion, you were often present, a reminder of the stability of her personal alliances. You saw firsthand how quickly the tone of a day could change. A report of a favourable Nile flood could lift the entire mood of the court, while news of unrest in a distant province could cast a shadow over every corridor. Afternoons brought a different kind of energy. The palace gardens became the stage for more informal gatherings. Here, shaded walkways wound between pools filled with lotus flowers and fish, and the sound of trickling water masked the murmur of conversations. Diplomats and high-ranking officials might join the Queen for these walks, where political discussions could unfold in a less rigid setting. This was one of the ways Cleopatra tested her guests, seeing how they spoke when the formality of the throne room was replaced by the apparent ease of the garden. As the sun dipped lower, preparations for the evening meal began. Musicians rehearsed in side chambers, and torches were lit in the colonnades. The kitchen staff shifted to more elaborate work, roasting meats, preparing pastries, and arranging fruits in ornate displays. The evening meal was not always a grand banquet, but even smaller gatherings carried the same precision. Guests were arranged by political relevance, and every course was chosen to make an impression. The flicker of lamplight on golden glassware gave the palace an almost otherworldly glow, and by the time the food arrived, the setting itself had already performed half the work of persuasion. When the meal ended, the palace did not fall silent. In the inner chambers, private discussions continued late into the night. Messages were written by candlelight, sealed with wax, and sent out with trusted couriers under the cover of darkness. Guards rotated at the gates and along the walls, their footsteps echoing in the cool air. The outer courtyards quieted, but the harbour beyond was still active, ships loading and unloading by torchlight, the calls of sailors carrying faintly to the palace. The transition from day to night was marked by the final patrol of the watch. Torches were checked, gates were secured, and the halls were left in the soft glow of oil lamps. Within the Queen's chambers, attendants prepared the room for rest, laying fresh linen on the bed and perfuming the air with myrrh. In your own quarters, the quiet was broken only by the occasional distant sound. The call of a night bird from the gardens, the muted clink of armour as guards passed by. The palace never truly slept. Somewhere within its walls, scribes continued their work, healers tended to the sick, and advisors prepared notes for the following day. This constant undercurrent of activity was part of the stability of Cleopatra's rule. To live here was to be part of an unending cycle of vigilance, luxury, and calculated display. And as you closed your eyes at the end of each day, the knowledge lingered that even in stillness, the machinery of Egypt's power was always turning. Military power in Cleopatra's Egypt was as much a statement of survival as it was a deterrent. In an age when Rome's legions could appear on distant shores with little warning, and when rival Hellenistic kingdoms still nursed ambitions, the ability to defend Egypt's coasts and borders was a necessity. To stand beside the Queen as she oversaw her military forces was to see that she did not treat war as a distant matter left entirely to generals. She understood the political language of ships and soldiers as fluently as she understood the subtleties of temple ritual. The navy was the jewel of Egypt's defences. Stationed primarily in the great harbour of Alexandria, it consisted of sleek warships built in the Greek trireme and quinquereme designs. Their hulls were reinforced with sturdy Lebanese cedar, their bronze rams polished to a mirror shine. Oarsmen worked in tight coordination, their rhythm kept by the beat of a drum, while sails of dyed linen could catch the Mediterranean winds when speed was required. From your place at her side, you could see the effect of a fully armed squadron lining the harbour. It was as much a display for the citizens of Alexandria as it was a warning to any foreign vessel considering hostile intentions. Naval drills were spectacles in themselves. Ships manoeuvred in complex patterns, simulating blockades, ramming attacks, and coordinated missile fire from decks lined with archers. These exercises were not only for training, they were political theatre, staged at times when foreign envoys were in the city, or when rumours of Roman restlessness began to circulate. The message was always clear. Egypt was not a passive prize waiting to be taken. It was a fortified kingdom prepared to meet aggression on its own terms. Coastal defences extended beyond the harbour. Watchtowers dotted the shoreline, their fires ready to signal the approach of any unknown fleet. Garrisons were stationed at key points along the coast and up the Nile, ensuring that reinforcements could be dispatched quickly. Fortified towns served as both logistical hubs and rallying points, stocked with grain, weapons, and medical supplies. The Ptolemaic military structure had been refined over centuries, drawing on both Greek and Egyptian traditions, and Cleopatra maintained it with an understanding that complacency could invite disaster. On land, Egypt's forces were a mixture of native Egyptian soldiers and Greek-trained troops. Infantry units drilled with spears, shields, and the sarissa, the long pike that had been the backbone of Macedonian warfare since the time of Alexander. Cavalry, though not as central to Egyptian warfare as to some other kingdoms, was maintained for both scouting and shock tactics. Mercenaries from regions as far away as Gaul and Numidia could also be found in her service, their skills valued for specific roles. Maintaining this diverse force required careful management, for different groups carried different loyalties and expectations. The Queen's involvement in military matters was not symbolic. She reviewed troops, inspected naval squadrons, and consulted with commanders on strategy. Reports of Roman troop movements, pirate activity in the eastern Mediterranean, or unrest along the southern borders were discussed in her presence. You would see maps unrolled across polished tables, small markers moved to represent ships or legions, and hear her question the assumptions of seasoned officers. In a world where female rulers were often underestimated in military affairs, her direct engagement was both a practical necessity and a calculated act of authority. Economics and warfare were inseparable. The grain that filled Alexandria's granaries was not only a source of wealth, but also the fuel that sustained armies and navies. Contracts with shipbuilders, armourers and suppliers were part of the broader web of loyalty that kept Egypt's defences strong. In times of tension, Cleopatra could divert resources to strengthen garrisons or expand patrols, a visible signal that the kingdom was ready for whatever might come. Rome's dominance in the Mediterranean meant that outright confrontation was risky, but the Queen understood the value of showing readiness without provoking open war. Naval escorts for grain shipments doubled as shows of force. Military reviews in the harbour could be timed to coincide with the arrival of foreign dignitaries. Even the repair and maintenance of ships became part of the political theatre, the sight of craftsmen at work on the massive hulls, a reminder that Egypt's fleet was not merely ornamental. The psychological aspect of military presence was just as important as its practical capabilities. Citizens who saw their ruler actively engaged in defence felt a greater sense of security, and foreign observers who witnessed the scale of Egypt's preparations thought twice before considering hostile action. You could sense it in the way conversation shifted after a particularly well-executed naval demonstration. The murmurs in the marketplace, the notes carried by foreign envoys back to their homelands. Standing beside her in these moments, you understood that the military was not an isolated branch of government, but a visible extension of Cleopatra's personal authority. The soldiers, the sailors, the fortresses, and the ships all served not just to guard Egypt's borders, but to project the image of a kingdom that was prepared, unified, and confident. The sight of her on the deck of a warship, with the harbour stretching out behind her and the sails snapping in the wind, was a reminder to all who saw it that Egypt's queen ruled not only through words and ceremony, but through the readiness to defend what was hers. The palace's medical world was a blend of ancient tradition and imported science, a place where the scent of incense mixed with the sharper notes of vinegar and crushed herbs. To live within Cleopatra's court was to have access to the most skilled healers in the kingdom, but also to witness the strange coexistence of spiritual ritual and practical treatment. Here, a physician might prescribe a poultice of honey and myrrh for a wound, while just across the courtyard, a priest of Sekhmet recited protective spells to drive away illness-causing spirits. Egyptian medicine had roots going back millennia, and much of it was preserved in temple archives. Priests trained in healing arts learned from papyrus scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus, which recorded hundreds of remedies, diagnoses, and surgical procedures. These texts described treatments for ailments ranging from simple cuts to more complex internal disorders, mixing herbal knowledge with religious incantations. Honey was used as an antiseptic, garlic and onions were prescribed for general vitality, and castor oil was valued for its purgative effects. The Greek influence in the Ptolemaic period added a more analytical approach. Greek-trained physicians, often followers of the Hippocratic tradition, emphasized observation of symptoms and bodily balance according to the theory of the four humours. Within the palace, these two approaches did not compete so much as intertwine. A healer might explain a fever as an excess of yellow bile, while also recommending offerings at a temple to restore cosmic harmony. The patient could expect both a medicinal drink and a ritual blessing, with neither considered less important than the other. Your proximity to Cleopatra meant that you saw the system at its finest. The royal physician was skilled in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, able to discuss anatomy while also directing temple rites. Treatments for the queen and her inner circle were prepared in a dedicated chamber, lined with shelves of clay jars, woven baskets, and bronze instruments. Here, frankincense resin sat beside imported cinnamon, while locally grown herbs like fenugreek and coriander dried in hanging bundles. Illness in the palace was treated with seriousness not just for health, but for politics. A ruler's vigour was linked directly to perceptions of divine favour. If the queen or someone in her close circle appeared weakened, it could feed rumours of instability. Thus, medical care was as much about prevention as cure. Diets were adjusted according to the seasons, and bathing rituals in scented water were prescribed for both cleanliness and symbolic purification. Massages with perfumed oils were common, meant to ease tension and promote circulation, but they also reinforced the image of luxury that surrounded the court. Surgery was rare but not unknown. Simple procedures such as draining abscesses or setting broken bones were performed using bronze scalpels and splints made from wood or reeds. Pain relief came in the form of herbal preparations, including extracts of mandrake and poppy, both of which could dull sensation, but also carried risks if misused. Infection was an ever-present danger, and even the most skilled healers relied heavily on antiseptic substances like honey and wine to clean wounds. Temple medicine still played a significant role. The goddess Sekhmet, associated with both war and healing, was a central figure in protective rites. Priests might recite long sequences of words over water, which was then sprinkled on the patient, or they might prepare amulets inscribed with protective symbols. In a society where the spiritual and the physical were inseparable, such acts were not dismissed as superstition, but embraced as part of a complete treatment plan. Foreign remedies found their way into the palace through trade. Spices from India, resins from Arabia, and minerals from Nubia expanded the range of treatments available. Cleopatra herself was known to experiment with cosmetics and perfumes, many of which had medicinal properties. Some skin creams doubled as antiseptics, and scented oils could repel insects as well as perfume the body. From your vantage point, it was clear that beauty, health, and politics overlapped constantly in her world. Medical knowledge was also a form of statecraft. By supporting physicians and temple healers, Cleopatra ensured loyalty from two influential groups: the educated elite who valued Greek science, and the priesthood who upheld Egyptian tradition. A single public recovery from illness, attributed to the combined power of skilled medicine and divine blessing, could reinforce her authority in both spheres. You saw how this care extended beyond the palace walls when it suited political aims. Grain shipments to restive regions might be accompanied by healers sent to treat local outbreaks of disease. Temple blessings could be arranged in honour of foreign dignitaries, subtly linking the health of their people to the goodwill of the Egyptian crown. In this way, healing was not merely a private matter, but part of the machinery of diplomacy and control. At night, when the corridors of the palace were quiet, the medical chambers still glowed with lamplight. Assistants ground herbs with stone mortars, strained infusions through linen cloth, and prepared small packets of remedies to be kept ready. The scent of myrrh and dried chamomile lingered in the air, mixing with the faint tang of vinegar. In these moments, you understood that the palace's health was maintained by constant vigilance, just like its politics and its defences. To live in Cleopatra's inner circle was to know that medicine here was never just about the body. It was about the mind, the image, and the unbroken perception of divine favour, and that was something no ruler could afford to lose. Luxury in Cleopatra's world was never simply a matter of taste. It was strategy worn on the body, an unspoken declaration that wealth, culture, and divine favour all flowed through her. Every detail, from the texture of the linen to the glint of a gemstone, was chosen for meaning as much as for beauty. Standing beside her, you saw that the act of dressing was as political as any council meeting. The foundation of her appearance began with linen woven from the finest Egyptian flax, bleached to a near-white brilliance, and so sheer it seemed woven from air. Egyptian linen was prized across the ancient world, and wearing it was a statement in itself, a reminder that Egypt produced materials no rival could equal. For more formal appearances, the linen was sometimes embroidered with gold thread, or edged with tiny glass beads that caught the light like drops of water. Cosmetics were equally deliberate. The famous kohl eyeliner was not just aesthetic. It served as both a beauty statement and a form of protection, reducing glare from the sun, and, according to Egyptian belief, warding off eye infections. The dark lines extended outward from the corners of the eyes, creating the elongated almond shape associated with depictions of gods and royalty. Malachite green was used in similar ways, connecting the wearer to the regenerative qualities symbolized by the color. Rouge for the cheeks, scented oils for the skin, and perfumes distilled from lotus and myrrh completed the effect. Each scent and color carried symbolic weight, communicating vitality, divine connection, or royal authority. Jewelry was perhaps the most potent tool in this visual language. Gold was abundant in Egypt, drawn from mines in Nubia, and it formed the base of much of the royal ornamentation. Necklaces layered with lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian told stories in colour. Blue for the heavens, green for fertility, red for life and power. Wide collars, heavy with inlays, framed the shoulders like halos of stone and metal. Armlets and bracelets in the shapes of serpents, lotus blossoms, and falcons encircled her limbs, each design carrying associations with protection, rebirth, or royal dominion. Crowns and headdresses were the clearest markers of role and occasion. The vulture crown linked her to Nekhbet, the goddess of Upper Egypt, while the uraeus, the rearing cobra, proclaimed her role as protector of the land. The solar disk flanked by cow horns connected her to Hathor and Isis, reinforcing her divine identity. These were not mere accessories. In the eyes of the Egyptian people, they were proof of the queen's legitimacy and her bond with the gods. Even her footwear could carry meaning. Sandals of papyrus or leather were decorated with images of foreign enemies on the soles, symbolically placing them beneath her feet with every step. Such details might be invisible to the casual observer, but they were never overlooked by those who understood the coded language of royal regalia. As her consort, you saw the preparation that went into these appearances. Attendants worked with quiet precision, layering garments, securing jewellery, and applying cosmetics in an order that was as much ritual as routine. Each item was inspected for perfection, and nothing was left to chance. When she emerged, it was not as a person simply dressed for the day. It was as an image crafted to embody the prosperity, unity, and divine favour of the kingdom. The effect on those who saw her was immediate. Foreign envoys might arrive expecting to negotiate with a mortal ruler, and instead find themselves addressing someone who seemed more than human. Citizens lining the streets during a procession would bow their heads not merely out of respect but out of awe. Even in the palace, where her attendants saw her daily, the completed transformation carried a power that could silence a room. Luxury in Cleopatra's Egypt was also a form of economic diplomacy. By wearing jewels sourced from distant lands, she demonstrated the reach of her trade networks. By using perfumes made from imported resins, she displayed the wealth to acquire goods that were rare even among the rich. Every detail was a reminder that Egypt's ruler commanded resources that extended far beyond the Nile Valley. And yet, there was a balance to be struck. Excess without meaning could be read as vanity, while restraint at the wrong moment could suggest weakness. Cleopatra navigated this with the same care she brought to her diplomacy, ensuring that her appearance always matched the message she wanted to send. A crown for a religious ceremony would emphasize divine connection. A diadem for a diplomatic meeting would signal royal dignity without overshadowing the guest. From your perspective beside her, you began to understand that luxury in her world was not about personal indulgence. It was a living form of statecraft, one that spoke in colours, textures, and scents. Every time she appeared in public, she was not just seen. She was read by her people, by her allies, and by her enemies. And the message was always the same. Egypt was powerful, Egypt was rich, and Egypt was eternal. The grandeur of Cleopatra's palace was matched by something far less visible, a network of information that flowed constantly through its halls, gardens, and even its kitchens. In a court where a whisper could shift political alliances, intelligence gathering was not a side activity. It was a foundation of survival. Standing close to the queen, you came to understand that the beauty and order of the palace were maintained not just by guards at the gates, but by unseen eyes and ears in every corner of Alexandria. The informants were rarely recognized for what they were. Some were scribes, ostensibly employed to keep records of taxes, grain shipments, and ceremonial proceedings. Others were servants who poured wine, prepared clothing, or swept floors, moving through the palace with the kind of invisibility that comes from familiarity. Still others were merchants and ship captains whose regular trade routes made them valuable sources of news from distant ports. Every piece of information had potential value. Reports about unrest in a provincial town might indicate more than local discontent. They could reveal weaknesses in the grain supply chain, or the influence of a rival faction. Word of a Roman senator's financial troubles could be turned into leverage in diplomatic negotiations. Even gossip about minor officials had its place, for in the palace, reputations were as much a currency as silver or gold. The flow of information was carefully managed. Messengers carrying sensitive news rarely approached the queen directly. Instead, They passed their words through trusted intermediaries who sorted the urgent from the trivial before it reached her. This prevented her from being overwhelmed by every minor rumour, but it also allowed for verification. False information, whether spread deliberately or by mistake, could be as dangerous as an enemy army. Cleopatra used this intelligence with precision. When she greeted a foreign envoy, she often already knew the state of his finances, his political alliances, and even the mood of his household. In audiences with Egyptian officials, she might refer casually to events in their home regions, letting them know, without saying so directly, that she was aware of the realities on the ground. This subtle display of knowledge was disarming to some and intimidating to others, but it always reinforced the perception that nothing in her kingdom escaped her attention. The network extended far beyond Alexandria. Informants operated in border garrisons, coastal ports and trading hubs deep in the Nile Valley. Some were loyal through personal allegiance, others through payment, and some through the simple understanding that serving the Queen's interest was safer than opposing them. Foreign merchants seeking favour might bring news of political changes in other courts. Egyptian priests might relay the mood of their temple communities. Ship captains returning from Greece or the Levant could carry both goods and rumours, each of which might shape future decisions. There was an art to protecting this network. No single person knew all of its members, and information was rarely shared in full with any one agent. This kept the system resilient, even if part of it was compromised. It also allowed Cleopatra to act on intelligence without revealing the source, maintaining both the secrecy and the credibility of her decisions. Within the palace, the presence of this network created a quiet tension. Conversations were measured, and even private exchanges were carried out with an awareness that someone might be listening. For you, it was a constant reminder that being close to the Queen meant living in a place where trust was carefully rationed. It was not paranoia. It was the natural state of a court where power could shift with the turn of a phrase. The information collected was not always used immediately. Some details were kept for months or even years, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. A minor official's private indiscretion might seem unimportant until his influence grew, at which point it could be used to secure his cooperation or to remove him quietly from his position. The timing was as important as the content, and Cleopatra had a talent for waiting until a piece of intelligence would have its maximum effect. From your vantage point, you began to see how this web of observation was one of her greatest strengths. Armies could be defeated in battle, and treasuries could be emptied by bad harvests. But a ruler who understood the minds and movements of her subjects and her enemies could shape events before they happened. The palace's informants were not glamorous figures. They blended into the background, going about their duties as if nothing were unusual. Yet together they formed a shield as vital as any wall or fortress. In this way, the Queen's true reach extended far beyond the throne room. She ruled not only through law, ceremony and diplomacy, but through a constant stream of unseen knowledge. And for those who underestimated her, it was often this invisible force that proved most decisive. Religion in Cleopatra's Egypt was never a separate sphere from politics. It was the stage upon which politics played its most persuasive scenes. To stand beside her in these moments was to see how sacred ritual could be transformed into deliberate theatre, with every hymn, offering and gesture carrying the weight of statecraft. Temple restorations were among her most visible religious acts, and they were always chosen with care. Restoring a neglected shrine was not simply an act of piety. It was a political signal to the surrounding population that the Queen valued their traditions and upheld her duty as a living link between humanity and the gods. In Egypt, the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Mayat, the divine balance of order in the universe. A temple left in disrepair could be interpreted as a breach of this sacred duty, and thus a sign of weakness. Repairing it, on the other hand, demonstrated prosperity, stability, and divine favour. The work itself was a spectacle. Massive blocks of limestone were hauled into place by teams of labourers, the sound of chisels and hammers echoing across the site. Sculptors restored damaged reliefs of gods and goddesses, repainting them in the vivid colours of ancient tradition. Priests oversaw the process, ensuring that every step followed the ritual guidelines preserved in temple archives. These projects employed hundreds of workers, which in itself was a display of royal generosity and economic strength. When a restoration was complete, the dedication ceremony could rival any military parade in its grandeur. The approach to the temple would be lined with banners, the air heavy with the scent of burning incense. Musicians played sistrums and drums in steady rhythms, their sounds mingling with the chant of priests reciting hymns that dated back centuries. Cleopatra appeared in full ceremonial regalia, her crown gleaming in the sunlight, her robes of fine linen flowing around her like water. Inside the temple, the rituals followed a sequence that had been performed for generations. Offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit were presented to the gods, along with vessels of scented oil and precious metals. Priests purified the sanctuary with water from the Nile, its surface shimmering as it poured from gold-handled jugs. The statue of the temple's patron deity was adorned with fresh garments and jewels, a symbolic renewal of the bond between god and ruler. From your place near the inner sanctum, you could see how skillfully Cleopatra used these moments to bind religion and politics together. She did not merely stand as a participant in the rites, she positioned herself as their central figure, the mediator whose actions ensured that the gods remained favourable to Egypt. For the people watching, the connection was clear. Their prosperity depended on her ability to uphold these sacred responsibilities. Public processions amplified this message even further. When the queen travelled to major festivals, she often appeared in the guise of a goddess. During the Feast of Ope in Thebes, for instance, the sacred bark carrying the image of a moon would be paraded from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by music, dancing, and offerings. Cleopatra's presence in such processions was a declaration that she was not only ruler, but also a divine agent on earth. To the Egyptian mind, this was not metaphor. It was reality, woven into the cosmic order itself. The political impact of these appearances was profound. By aligning herself so closely with the gods, Cleopatra reinforced her legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian populace, who might otherwise view the Macedonian dynasty as foreign rulers. Her fluency in Egyptian language and her deep participation in traditional rites set her apart from many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, making her appear as both a continuation of the ancient pharaonic line and a ruler uniquely capable of guiding Egypt through the threats of her time. Even foreign observers were not immune to the effect. Roman envoys who attended these ceremonies might not share the Egyptian religious worldview, but they could see the loyalty and reverence such displays inspired. They understood that undermining a ruler with such a strong sacred identity would require more than military force. It would require dismantling the very beliefs that tied her to her people. From your perspective, the most striking thing was how seamless it all felt. There was no visible dividing line between devotion and politics, between offering incense to the gods and securing loyalty from the provinces. It was all one continuous performance, as essential to the survival of the kingdom as its armies and its grain. And you, walking in the shadow of temple pylons carved with stories older than most empires, could feel that this union of religion and rulership was the heartbeat of Cleopatra's Egypt. The harbour of Alexandria was the city's pulse, a vast expanse of water bordered by quays, warehouses, and the silhouettes of mast that rose like a forest against the horizon. It was here that Egypt's wealth met the wider Mediterranean, and it was here that Cleopatra's power was both demonstrated and reinforced through the constant movement of goods, ships, and people. To walk with her along the colonnaded causeways or to stand beside her as she oversaw the arrival of a foreign fleet was to see how much of her kingdom's influence was anchored in these waters. The harbour itself was divided into sections, each with its own purpose. The great harbour handled the bulk of trade, grain outbound to Rome, incoming shipments of luxury goods from the Levant, timber from Phoenicia, silver from Hispania, and exotic animals from Africa's interior. The Eunostos harbour, smaller but no less vital, served as a base for ship repairs and maintenance, with dry docks and workshops ringing its edges. Warships were moored in protected positions, their crews maintaining constant readiness in case a diplomatic crisis turned quickly into a military one. Over all of this loomed the Pharaoh's lighthouse, a marvel of engineering that guided ships safely into port. Its white limestone walls rose in stepped tiers, and at the top, a polished bronze mirror reflected sunlight by day and firelight by night. Sailors claimed it could be seen from dozens of miles away, a beacon that not only kept them safe, but also proclaimed to every approaching vessel that they were entering a city unlike any other. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and in Cleopatra's reign, it doubled as a political symbol, a statement that Egypt's wealth and ingenuity could still rival Rome's military dominance. The docks were a riot of activity from sunrise to nightfall. Merchants shouted prices in a jumble of languages: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and others from farther east. Longshoremen carried amphorae filled with wine or olive oil, their bare feet gripping the worn planks. Scribes with wax tablets moved among the workers, noting each shipment for the royal tax collectors. The smell of brine mixed with the aromas of spices, fish, and pitch, creating a heady atmosphere that seemed to sum up the entire Mediterranean in a single breath. Security here was more than a matter of guards. Cleopatra's officials maintained a close watch on who came and went, mindful that the harbour was both a source of revenue and a potential point of infiltration. Ships were inspected not only for their cargo, but for the intentions of those aboard. Foreign emissaries might be met before they even stepped onto the quay, guided to controlled reception points where they could be observed and impressed in equal measure. Trade agreements were often negotiated right here, amid the noise of loading cranes and the creak of ships' rigging. A visiting merchant prince from Asia Minor might be granted favourable docking rights in exchange for supplying timber for shipbuilding. A grain shipment bound for Rome could be delayed or expedited depending on the current state of political negotiations. Every deal was part of a broader strategy, and every arrival was an opportunity to reinforce Egypt's position in the Mediterranean network of trade and influence. From your place beside the Queen, you could see that this was more than commerce. It was an information hub. News travelled with the cargo, whispers of political unrest in a distant city, rumours of a new alliance forming, or the latest movements of Roman fleets. The harbour was as much a source of intelligence as it was of wealth, and Cleopatra ensured that trusted agents were always stationed there to gather and report anything of interest. The goods themselves told their own stories. Ivory tusks hinted at Egyptian influence deep into African trade routes. Stacks of papyrus rolls ready for export reminded visitors that Egypt's written word was as valuable as its grain. Spices from India and Arabia spoke of trade networks that reached far beyond the Mediterranean. These shipments were more than merchandise. They were symbols of Egypt's reach, each amphora and crate a testament to connections that spanned continents. When the sun dipped toward the horizon, the harbour shifted into a different kind of life. Torches flared along the quays, casting long shadows over the water. The work slowed but never stopped. Ships still unloaded goods under flickering light, and night markets sprang up near the warehouses, where sailors and merchants could eat, drink and barter under the watchful eyes of the city guard. The lighthouse's flame burned steadily, its light sweeping across the waves in slow, deliberate arcs. In moments like these, standing beside her at the water's edge, you could feel the harbour's role as both a gateway and a shield. It was the place where Egypt's wealth left to shape the fortunes of distant lands, and where the outside world arrived to be measured, welcomed, or kept at bay. And in the quiet between the calls of dock workers and the creak of ships at anchor, it became clear that as long as the harbour thrived, so too would Cleopatra's Egypt. Entertaining foreign rulers aboard Cleopatra's royal barge was unlike any other kind of diplomatic meeting. On land, a guest could still imagine they were on equal footing. On the Nile, surrounded by her crew, her attendants, and the overwhelming spectacle of Egypt's river kingdom, there was no question whose stage they had stepped onto. You quickly learned that every plank, every sail, every glint of gold aboard that vessel was part of a calculated performance. The barge itself was enormous by ancient standards, a floating palace designed to impress from the moment it came into view. Its hull was painted in deep, gleaming colours, accented with gold leaf that caught the sun. The prow often carried a carved figure of a sacred animal, a falcon, a lotus, or a rearing cobra, its eyes set with polished stones that seemed to watch the water ahead. The sails were dyed in rare purple, a colour so expensive that it instantly declared the wealth and reach of Egypt's trade networks. Guests boarding the barge were met with scents of burning myrrh and freshly crushed lotus petals. Musicians played soft, steady rhythms on harps and flutes, their music blending with the sound of the river against the hull. Servants offered wine or chilled water flavoured with mint, a small luxury in the Egyptian heat. The temperature aboard was moderated by awnings of fine linen, their edges fluttering in the breeze. Everything was arranged to lull a guest into comfort before the true business began. Meals on the barge were events in themselves. Tables were set with gold and silver dishes, each plate bearing foods chosen as much for their symbolism as their taste. Nile fish prepared with coriander and cumin spoke of the river's bounty. Imported dates from the Levant hinted at Egypt's far-reaching trade connections. Honey cakes and spiced wine closed the meal, sweet enough to leave a lasting impression long after the guest had disembarked. The order of dishes, the pace of the courses, even the placement of cups and utensils were deliberate, ensuring that the guest remained in a state of slow, steady amazement. Cleopatra used these gatherings to speak directly to the senses. The gentle rocking of the barge, the sight of green riverbanks dotted with temples, the distant calls of farmers tending their fields, all of it created a setting in which Egypt's fertility and stability were impossible to ignore. Between courses, she would guide the conversation to topics that mattered most: grain exports, military cooperation, shared enemies, or potential marriage alliances. It was politics woven seamlessly into hospitality. The positioning of guests was another subtle tactic. Those she most wanted to influence were seated nearest to her, close enough to engage in direct conversation. Others were placed where they could see her profile framed against the Nile, a view that reinforced her image as both ruler and goddess. Attendants and guards moved with quiet precision, their presence a reminder that this was not merely a social outing but a gathering under her control. The river itself was part of the performance. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline, its floods feeding the crops that sustained millions. By meeting on the water, Cleopatra tied her guest's experience directly to the source of her kingdom's power. She could point to distant temple pylons and speak of the god's favour, or gesture toward the fertile banks and speak of the prosperity her reign protected. Each view was chosen for its symbolic value. From your place at her side, you could see how effective this was. Even hardened envoys who arrived with strict negotiating positions often left the barge softened by the experience, their demands tempered by the memory of an afternoon spent in an environment where every detail whispered of abundance, stability, and authority. As the meal ended, the barge would drift slowly back toward its mooring. The sails furled to allow the oarsmen to control the pace of the return. Torches were lit as the sun sank low, their reflections dancing on the water. Farewells were made on the deck, with gifts presented in finely worked boxes, small enough to carry, valuable enough to remember. By the time the guests stepped back onto the shore, they were leaving not just a meeting, but an unforgettable display of Egypt's grace and power. And you, watching the whole performance unfold, understood that diplomacy here was not simply about words spoken across a table. It was about the creation of an atmosphere so rich, so controlled, and so deeply tied to the land and river that leaving without a sense of awe was almost impossible. The treasury of Cleopatra's Egypt was not a single vault, but a network of storerooms, counting chambers, and guarded granaries that formed the hidden backbone of her rule. To walk through its inner halls was to see the material foundation upon which every feast, every military expedition, and every diplomatic gesture rested. Gold crowns and jewel-encrusted sceptres might dazzle the eye, but here was the true source of power, carefully weighed, meticulously recorded, and fiercely protected. The main treasury building in Alexandria was set apart from the palace, but connected to it by guarded corridors. Its exterior was plain compared to the ornate halls of state, a deliberate choice to draw less attention from the street. Inside, however, the atmosphere was heavy with the quiet authority of order and wealth. Clay jars and amphorae lined the walls in endless rows, each sealed with stamped clay that identified its contents. Coin, precious metals, spices, incense, or even rare pigments used in royal decoration. Gold from Nubian mines flowed into the treasury in the form of ingots, coins, and worked ornaments. Silver, rarer in Egypt, arrived through trade with the Greek islands and the Levant. These metals were counted on bronze scales, their weight recorded by scribes trained to catch even the smallest discrepancy. The coins bore the queen's image, a constant reminder to those who handled them that Egypt's wealth was inseparable from her authority. Every time money changed hands, her face passed between fingers, reinforcing her presence far beyond the palace walls. The grain reserves were an equally important part of the treasury's holdings. Massive state granaries stored the surplus from Egypt's fertile floodplains, their high mud brick walls designed to keep out pests and moisture. Grain was measured not just in quantity but in political value. A well-timed release to feed a famine-stricken province could secure loyalty for years. A delayed shipment to Rome could send a pointed message about Egypt's autonomy without a single soldier being moved. From your position near the queen, you saw how the movement of grain could be as sharp a tool as any weapon in her arsenal. Luxury goods also filled the treasury's storerooms. Bales of fine linen woven in the Nile Delta, blocks of incense resin from Arabia, ivory tusks from Africa's interior, carved gemstones from India, and amphorae of spiced wine from Crete were stored under lock and key. These were not simply for personal use. They were diplomatic currency, gifts to be deployed when forging alliances or rewarding loyalty. A single necklace of lapis lazuli could be worth more in influence than its weight in gold. The records of the treasury were as valuable as its physical contents. Scribes worked in tall ceilinged rooms filled with scrolls and wax tablets, their reed pens scratching steadily as they tracked every deposit and withdrawal. These records formed a living map of Egypt's economy, its surpluses, its shortages, and its hidden reserves. Cleopatra could summon these figures at will, using them to make rapid decisions in trade negotiations or military planning. Numbers here were not abstract. They were the difference between stability and collapse. Security was constant. Guards stood at every entrance, and their number increased at night. Only a select few held the keys to the inner storerooms, and those keys were themselves guarded objects, kept under seal when not in use. Shipments arriving from the provinces were inspected and counted before being stored, with witnesses present to verify the amounts. Any discrepancy, no matter how small, triggered an investigation. In a system where loyalty could be bought and sold, trust was never taken for granted. The Queen's control over the treasury gave her a flexibility that many rulers lacked. She could fund a sudden military campaign without appealing to outside lenders. She could stage an elaborate religious festival to calm unrest. She could discreetly provide financial support to allies abroad, keeping them loyal without drawing public attention. Every coin, every bushel of grain, every jar of oil was a piece on a board she moved with careful precision. From your vantage point, it was clear that this network of wealth was not just about accumulation. It was about movement, knowing when to hold, when to spend, and when to let a show of generosity disguise a strategic calculation. The world saw Cleopatra's power in her processions, her fleets, and her feasts. Here, in the guarded chambers of the treasury, you saw the source of it all, quietly waiting to be transformed into action. And you understood that as long as the vaults were full and the granaries secure, the Queen could face down any rival, outlast any siege, and remind the world that Egypt's strength was not a matter of chance. It was the result of wealth managed like a weapon. By the final years of Cleopatra's reign, the air in Alexandria carried a weight that was not from the humid sea breeze alone. Rome's presence, once distant and diplomatic, had become an ever-tightening pressure. Ships in the harbour now included not only the merchant vessels that had long been Egypt's lifeline, but also Roman galleys whose crews kept a quiet, constant watch. The Queen's court still glittered, her processions still dazzled, and her banquet still overflowed with abundance, but beneath the surface there was a tension as steady as the Nile's current. From your place beside her, you could feel the shift. Diplomatic meetings that once unfolded at a comfortable pace now carried an urgency. Intelligence from the informant network arrived more frequently, often with news of political shifts in Rome's Senate or military deployments in the eastern Mediterranean. Rome was a city that thrived on opportunism, and Egypt, for all its wealth, was now the greatest prize left outside its formal grasp. Internally, the balance of the kingdom had to be maintained with even greater care. Provincial governors needed reassurance that the throne was unshaken. The priesthood had to be kept firmly in alliance, its support vital for maintaining the perception of divine favour. The army and navy remained vigilant, but even the most disciplined forces could not match the sheer scale of Roman military power. What Egypt had was position, resources, and the Queen's ability to weave politics, spectacle, and diplomacy into a shield. The treasury still held gold, silver, and grain in abundance, but each movement of wealth was weighed against the growing likelihood of conflict. A shipment of grain to Rome could maintain goodwill, or be interpreted as submission. Holding it back could send a warning, or be taken as provocation. Cleopatra played this game with the precision of a seasoned strategist, but the space in which she could maneuver was narrowing with every passing season. Public displays became more important than ever. Processions through Alexandria were staged with flawless precision, designed to project unity and prosperity. Temple ceremonies were lavish, reinforcing her role as the living embodiment of Maat. In these moments, the crowd still roared with devotion, still showered the streets with petals, still looked upon her as a ruler chosen by the gods. Yet you could see in the eyes of her closest advisors that these performances were also fortifications, walls of image and loyalty built to hold back the tide. Foreign envoys from Rome arrived more frequently, their demands couched in the language of cooperation, but edged with the inevitability of imperial ambition. Cleopatra met them with her usual blend of hospitality and calculated resistance, but each negotiation seemed to demand more concessions than the last. You were present when her tone shifted subtly, the moments when the conversation moved from what Egypt would give to what it would require in return. Even in the face of pressure, she refused to appear as anything less than an equal. Life in the palace carried on with its familiar rhythms, but the undercurrent was different. Feasts were held, but with an eye toward impressing or persuading key guests rather than simply celebrating. Military drills in the harbour seemed to carry a sharper edge, the precision of the oars and the gleam of the bronze rams as much a message to watchers as an exercise for the crews. Even the gardens, once places for leisurely walks, now served as quieter spaces for private conversations with allies whose loyalty had to be kept warm. For you, these years were a constant lesson in the fragility of grandeur. You could stand beside her during a temple dedication and feel the surge of the crowd's devotion, yet know that beyond the city walls, the world's most relentless empire was measuring the cost of absorbing Egypt into its domain. You could sit with her aboard the royal barge, gliding over the Nile's shimmering surface, yet be aware that the river's calm masked the growing turbulence in the wider Mediterranean. Cleopatra faced these pressures as she had faced every challenge, by folding them into her performance of power. She made Rome's emissaries dine beneath painted ceilings that told of Egypt's eternal rule. She greeted foreign fleets in the shadow of the Pharos, as if the lighthouse's light shone by her command alone. She continued to speak as the ruler of a kingdom unbowed, even as the realities beyond her borders pressed closer. You knew that no matter the outcome, you were living in a moment that history would remember. Egypt still gleamed, the palace still hummed with life, and the queen still held her head high before all who came to see her. Yet there was an unspoken awareness in those final years that the brilliance of Cleopatra's Egypt was also its last blaze before the horizon shifted forever. And standing at her side, with the harbour's winds carrying the mingled scents of myrrh and sea salt, you understood that your life as Cleopatra's royal lover had been more than privilege, more than danger, more than luxury. It had been a place in the very heart of a kingdom standing at the edge of history, holding its splendour in full view of the world, even as the world prepared to change. And so, as you slip off to sleep, remember, being Cleopatra's royal lover wasn't just about gold, incense, and being fanned with peacock feathers. It was also about dodging Roman politics, sitting through banquets where the appetizers were more expensive than most houses, and pretending you knew exactly what the priests were chanting when you definitely didn't. If you enjoyed spending the night wrapped in linen sheets, trying not to spill wine on the Queen's imported rugs, then maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. It costs a lot less than a barge ride with Cleopatra, and is only slightly less life-threatening. And if you don't subscribe, well, let's just say the palace informants are very good at their jobs. Sweet dreams, and may your eyeliner never smudge under political pressure.